Most of the time, it doesn't really matter if you make a mistake in the rules in Dungeons & Dragons, but if you're anything like me, then it probably bugs you. Some of the rules in D&D can be as obscure as, well, the rules for being hidden and obscured. And so today we're going to go over some of the repeat offenders that I see at my over 300 games a year of Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to start with crits. Because we like to make things complicated in Dungeons & Dragons, we have some of the rules for crits separated out in two different places in the player's handbook. There's not only the explanation of what happens when you critical hit, but separately a section on rolling a 1 or a 20 that is only specific to attacks. It reads, "Sometimes fate blesses or curses a combatant, causing the novice to hit and the veteran to miss. If the d20 roll for an attack is a 20, the attack hits regardless of any modifiers to the target's AC. This is called a critical hit, which is explained later in this chapter. If the d20 roll for an attack is a 1, the attack misses regardless of any modifiers or the target's AC. The big mistake that gets made when it comes to crits is that this rule is very specifically only talking about attack rolls. There's no such thing as a critical success or failure on ability checks or saving throws. Meaning if you roll a natural 1 on a DC 10 concentration check, if you have a +9 bonus, you automatically succeed and don't even really need to bother wasting the dice roll. While rolling a natural 1 or 20 happens almost every session, there are some rules that only come up occasionally, and we make the mistake because of that. The rules for underwater combat in Chapter 9 of the Player's Handbook are a great example of that problem. When making a melee weapon attack, a creature that doesn't have a swimming speed, either natural or granted by magic, has disadvantage on the attack roll unless the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident. A ranged weapon attack automatically misses a target beyond the weapon's normal range. Even against a target within normal range, the attack roll has disadvantage unless the weapon is a crossbow, a net, or a weapon that is thrown like a javelin, including a spear, trident, or dart. Creatures and objects that are fully immersed in water have resistance to fire damage. Mistakes that are commonly made in this particular department is simply remembering that if you are underwater, you have disadvantage on all attacks unless you're using this short list of piercing weapons. Recognizing they're all piercing weapons is one easy way to keep track, though notably the rapier and pike and several other piercing weapons are not included in this short list. The other mistake is that range weapons, even those that don't have disadvantage on their attack rolls, are only able to shoot up to their normal range, which is often referred to as the short range of the weapon rather than the long range that is included in the second parentheses. This means that a hand crossbow's normal range of 30 feet is the effective complete and total range underwater, even though it doesn't suffer the disadvantage that short bows, long bows, and many other range weapons are suffering. It's worth noting that we commonly forget that creatures underwater have resistance to fire damage at all times because it doesn't get included in stat blocks and it tends to get skipped. Also remember, if you're underwater, you're going to need to be referring to the rules for holding your breath, which frustratingly are found by searching for suffocating in Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook. Since you can hold your breath for a particularly long time underwater, the thing to remember most is that if you cast a spell with a verbal component, you are no longer holding your breath and thus begin actual suffocation. You can survive for a number of rounds equal to your Constitution modifier with a minimum of 1 round, but at the start of the round following that, you drop to 0 hit points and are dying and cannot be healed until you are capable of breath again. As a holdover from older editions and video games, the term surprise round is still ubiquitous in Dungeons & Dragons, even though technically there's no such thing. The DM determines who might be surprised. If neither side tries to be stealthy, they automatically notice each other. Otherwise, the DM compares dexterity stealth checks of anyone hiding with the passive perception score of each creature on the opposing side. Any character or monster that doesn't notice a threat is surprised at the start of the encounter. If you're surprised, you can't move or take an action on your first turn of the combat, and you can't take a reaction until that turn ends. A member of a group can be surprised even if the other members aren't. The important things that get missed in most surprise round situations is that all parties that are going to take part in the battle, even after the surprise is over, roll initiative, and you can't take your reaction until after your turn ends. Essentially, surprised is a condition, not a period of time. Found in Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook, the rules on Darkvision don't always shed light on things. Within a specified range, a creature with Darkvision can see in dim light as if it were bright light, and in darkness as if it were dim light. So areas of darkness are only lightly obscured as far as that creature is concerned. However, the creature can't discern color in that darkness, only shades of gray. Fortunately, all of the rules that are referred to in this section are right here in the Vision and Light section of the Player's Handbook. Less fortunately, the idea of dark vision, meaning that you can see in the dark as well as people can see in the daylight, is pretty ingrained in the culture of players of Dungeons & Dragons for whatever reason. I guess the name sort of makes it just make sense. What gets messed up most about dark vision is that when you're in absolute darkness, your vision is actually significantly impaired. In fact, because everything is essentially in dim lighting to you, you have disadvantage on all perception checks, which means a -5 to your passive perception check, making it much harder for you to spot dangers and other skulking adversaries. Also, because you're seeing in dim lighting, it means that creatures who are sneaking in that dim lighting have light obscurement, which qualifies them to continue to hide in that darkness. This means that somebody can sneak right up to you using the long shadows and the darkness around you to obscure their approach so that they can get up close and drive a dagger home. But we'll be talking more about hiding rules a little bit later. The rule of thumb to remember is that dark vision just upgrades light one category, and then to master those categories. The biggest problem with concentration being forgotten in Dungeons & Dragons is that its rules are in a few different places. In Chapter 10, under duration in spellcasting, is the bulk of them. Normal activity such as moving and attacking doesn't interfere with concentration. The following factors can break concentration. Casting another spell that requires concentration. You lose concentration on a spell if you cast another spell that requires concentration. You can't concentrate on two spells at once. Taking damage. Whenever you take damage while you're concentrating on a spell, you must make a Constitution saving throw to maintain your concentration. The DC equals 10 or half the damage you take, whichever number is higher. If you take damage from multiple sources, such as an arrow and a dragon's breath, you make a separate saving throw for each source of damage. Being incapacitated or killed. You lose concentration on a spell if you're incapacitated or if you die. And who would have guessed that last part? What gets missed most often in concentration is that many different status effects break your concentration because they impart the incapacitated condition. These include paralyzed, petrified, stunned, and unconscious, as well as the new options for gaining the incapacitated condition directly from something like Roltham's Psychic Lance. The second point that can unintendedly break somebody's concentration is readying a spell. Because according to Chapter 9 of the Player's Handbook, readying a spell requires concentration. This means that if your wizard happens to have a crossbow, they can ready to shoot somebody when they come around the corner, but they can't ready to fling a firebolt at them unless the moment they enact that ready action, they're willing to sacrifice concentration on the more powerful magic that they've got on the field. The bonus action rule is unsurprisingly challenging for people to keep track of. It just doesn't feel intuitive. Found in Chapter 10 under the casting time section of spellcasting, it reads like this. A spell cast with a bonus action is especially swift. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast the spell, provided that you haven't already taken a bonus action this turn. You can't cast another spell during the same turn except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. This one doesn't feel terribly intuitive because if you've already cast a non-cantrip spell and then you try to cast a bonus action spell, you're not able to do that. But if you do it in the reverse, you're also not able to do that. This has been summarized in some cases by calling it the one-leveled spell rule, though spellcasters that somehow gain action surge from the fighter class are able to break that rule too. Essentially, the point to remember is that anytime you are going to cast a bonus action, you cannot cast, even from an item, a spell that would normally be a first or higher level spell. It's either cantrip and bonus action leveled spell, or leveled spell and a bonus action that does not have anything to do with spellcasting. If a magic item has an effect like a spell but does not use the word cast in its description, then you are safe to utilize it alongside a bonus action. Look for the word cast, and remember, if it says cast and it's not a cantrip, you can't do it alongside a bonus action spell. In Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook, in special types of movement, jumping is included, and there are two types of jumping. The first is a long jump. When you make a long jump, you cover a number of feet up to your strength score if you moved at least 10 feet on foot immediately before the jump. When you make a standing long jump, you can leap only half that distance. Either way, each foot you clear on the jump costs a foot of movement. This assumes that nothing is in your way and that you're able to clear the obstacle with the amount of distance covered. If there's something in the way that is no more than a quarter of the height of the jump that you're capable of doing, the DM might impose a small athletics check of a DC 10 in order for you to clear it. If you land in difficult terrain, you are supposed to make a DC 10 acrobatics check in order to land on your feet instead of falling prone. Then there's the high jump. When you make a high jump, you leap into the air a number of feet equal to 3 plus your strength modifier with a minimum of 0. If you move at least 10 feet on foot immediately before that jump. When you make a standing high jump, you can jump only half that distance. Either way, each foot you clear on the jump costs a foot of movement. In some circumstances, there might be a strength athletics check to jump higher than you normally can. You can extend your arms half your height above yourself during the jump. Thus, you can reach above you a distance equal to the height of the jump plus 1.5 times your height. This is a whole bunch of numbers for both of these that are honestly kind of crazy when you think about them from a realistic standpoint, but even if we're just focused on the game portions of this, it's important for us to just keep a couple of numbers in mind. For long jumps, those numbers are your strength score distance if you've got a 10-foot start, half of that if you don't. For a high jump, that's 3 plus your strength modifier feet in height if you've got a 10-foot start, half of that if you don't. And remember that you can reach an extra half of your height above yourself when you're trying to grab a ledge to pull yourself up a little bit later. Probably the most forgotten portion of this, though, is the acrobatics check to land it in difficult terrain. But hopefully you won't forget it now that we've talked about it. The rules for cover hide a lot of things, partially because there's some nuances hidden in different parts of the books. In Chapter 9 of the Player's Handbook, under cover, there are 3 types of cover listed: half cover, 3/4 cover, and total cover. A target has half cover if an obstacle blocks at least half of its body. A target with 3/4 cover has a +5 bonus to armor class and dexterity saving throws. A target has 3/4 cover if about 3/4 of it is covered by an obstacle. A target has total cover if it is completely concealed by an obstacle. Some of the most commonly forgotten portions of cover are the increase to dexterity saving throws. Hiding behind a wall really does help you against a fireball that blows up on the other side of it, even if the flames round the corner in order to harm you. If you have cover compared to the target point of the spell, then you have added protection. However, the other portion of cover that gets forgotten can be found in Chapter 10 under Spellcasting in the Targets section. According to this section, you need a clear path to your target. To target something, you must have a clear path to it, so it can't be behind total cover. If you place an area of effect at a point that you can't see, and an obstruction such as a wall is between you and that point, the point of origin comes into being on the near side of that obstruction. This means that firing off into the darkness can have unintended consequences as your fireball runs into a wall just outside of sight and fries your friends. It also, however, means that a creature that has total cover in comparison to you cannot be targeted even if you can see it. For instance, if there's a wall of force between you and they, you can't fireball them, shatter them, or otherwise target them with any spell that would try to pass through that wall in order to reach them. Some of the notable exceptions to this include things like Misty Step that target you and then have an effect that appears somewhere else, which does get you past a wall of force, or Sacred Flame, which specifically ignores cover. One of the other common mistakes is that if you can't target an area, then you can't include that area in some of the more far-reaching, higher-powered spells. A great example of which is Forbiddance. I know I've seen at least 2 shorts of people talking about how they're going to cast Forbiddance on a dungeon so that all of the creatures inside horribly die. But in order to cast Forbiddance on an area, you need to have that area not have total cover from you while you're casting. So if you can hold concentration for 10 minutes while walking throughout every single room on the dungeon, then have at it. But if not, don't expect this spell to be used offensively to start clearing dungeon floors. There's a lot of confusion about the rules for hiding in Dungeons & Dragons. Though they can be found in Chapter 7 of the Player's Handbook, it's not surprising when they start with words like "the DM determines under what circumstances you can hide" that there's going to be some chances for players and DMs to have different ideas of what's possible. When you try to hide, you make a dexterity stealth check. Until you're discovered or you stop hiding, that check's total is contested by the wisdom perception check of any creature that is actively searching for signs of your presence. It also mentions later that to determine whether a creature notices you passively, you would compare that dexterity stealth check with a creature's passive wisdom perception score. According to this, one of the main factors in determining whether you can find a hidden creature or object is how well you can see an area, which might be lightly or heavily obscured. It says in here you can't hide from a creature that can see you clearly, and you give away your position if you make noise such as shouting a warning or knocking over a vase. An invisible creature can always try to hide, but signs of its passage might still be noticed, and it does have to stay quiet. This means that unless you're taking the action to hide, an invisible creature effectively is very knowable in where it is at any given time, even though you can't see it. There's a lot left up to DM interpretation there, and it gets kind of fuzzy. But from a rules perspective, one of the things that tells us whether or not you can hide is actually a racial subtype. The Mask of the Wild ability from the Wood Elf subtype says you can attempt to hide even when you're only lightly obscured by foliage, heavy rain, falling snow, mist, and other natural phenomena. This has been construed to mean that if you are heavily obscured, which imposes the blinded condition on an opponent, you can begin a hide action. That means that total cover or heavy obscurement are the requirements for you to actively hide away from your opponent so that they don't know precisely where you are. Keep in mind that being hidden doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know roughly where you are. If you haven't moved away from that spot, they might assume you're still there and start dropping fireballs or targeting that general area with attacks. Doing so blind, they'll have disadvantage, but that doesn't mean you won't get skewered. What often gets mistaken is that if you are at any point in time in the open, any attempt to hide is lost unless you have somehow distracted your opponent and got your DM's buy-in. This means that if you step out from cover in order to come up close and fight, or even fully into view before you shoot with your bow, you automatically lose the hidden condition and don't get the advantage on that attack roll. However, because it requires you to see an opponent clearly to automatically break stealth, then you can maintain stealth with cover of any degree or with light or heavy obscurement. Referring back to what we talked about Darkvision, this is why you can sneak up in pitch darkness against an opponent using Darkvision and still manage to avoid their notice even though you're otherwise out in the open. Grappling in 5th edition in our players' heads is usually some kind of awesome WWE wrestling moment, and yet the rules are really more like grabbing hold of somebody's sleeve when they're trying to get away from you. When you want to grab a creature or wrestle with it, you can use the attack action to make a special melee attack, a grapple. If you're able to make multiple attacks with the attack action, this attack replaces one of them. The target of your grapple must be no more than one size larger than you and must be within your reach. Using at least one free hand, you try to seize the target by making a grapple check instead of an attack roll. A strength athletics check contested by the target's strength athletics or dexterity acrobatics check. The target chooses the ability to use. You succeed automatically if the target is incapacitated. If you succeed, you subject the target to the grappled condition. The condition specifies the things that end it, and you can release the target whenever you like, no action required. To escape a grapple, a creature can use its action. To do so, it must succeed on a strength athletics or dexterity acrobatics check contested by your strength athletics check. When you move, you can drag or carry the grappled creature with you, but your speed is halved unless the creature is 2 or more sizes smaller than you. There's lots of different mistakes that pop up in here, which largely is about the mental image of grappling being some kind of awesome wrestling contest instead of just holding on to somebody so that they can't slip away from you while you duke it out, otherwise fighting like normal. The only penalty of the grapple condition is that a creature's speed is dropped to 0 and it can't benefit from anything that would increase that speed. But here are some of the common mistakes. Remember, you automatically succeed on a grapple if somebody's incapacitated, which again means that they're also automatically able to be grappled if they're paralyzed, petrified, stunned, or unconscious. It does still require an attack action and one part of your extra attack if you have that feature. You can drag an opponent with you, but often missed is that the specific ability is referring back to the ability to push, drag, or lift out of your carrying capacity, which means that minus whatever equipment you're carrying, the opponent can't weigh more than your strength score times 30. Unless you want to move with a maximum speed of 5 feet and be having that halved for carrying the creature along with you. The other common miss is that if a creature is 2 size categories smaller than you and you're grappling it, you don't get slowed down as it's effectively held in the palm of one hand, but if it's 2 size categories larger than you, you can't attempt to grapple it because you grabbing onto a giant's leg doesn't slow it down while it continues to walk, much like a toddler being dragged around by its parent. What rules trip you up at the table? Are there any that you're still not sure about? I host a monthly Q&A here live on YouTube where I answer questions and make sure to put chapters in later so that it's easy to reference. If you submit a question, including your username here on YouTube, I'll even tag you in it to make sure that you get the message. So if you've got a burning question, click on Kaya the Border Collie to submit it and I'll get right on it. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.